Okay, what's going on guys? Today we have an updated Hunter Prismatic build, which takes the core design we had a while back, which means we're not only going to be able to constantly melt everything by chaining between our dodge and melee to also go invisible, but since this season's artifact has a lot of perks benefiting both machine guns and void damage, we are going to take advantage of that to make this build a powerful ad clearing build, where we can either be up close and personal with our abilities, or have that range and distance, so that you're not basically having to be forced into the enemy's face 24/7. At the same time as this, you actually get two secondary build choices, and what I mean by this is that the exact same build is the same. You're still getting everything that the build has to offer, except you choose if you want a high damaging super for boss DPS by using the golden gun with Celestial Nighthawk, or if you'd rather play more aggressively with support, you can use a tether with Orpheus Rig to get faster supers as well. So whichever route you decide to take, it won't affect the core design of the build, which just gives you more choice and flexibility when it comes to using this build in any activity, because it's just a very simple change of swapping the super and exotic around, or if you really wanted to, just change the super and use an exotic that makes the core build design even better, which all of that I will get to later in the video. So guys, if you like this one, a rating is much appreciated, and now let's dive right in. Roll the intro. Now before we start, I just want to quickly mention that if you like this build, then you might like some of my other builds similar to this one, so you can find all of those builds in the playlist linked down below, as well as over on my Mobilix page, so be sure to check that out later when you get a moment. But in today's video, we are going to cover a newly updated Hunter build that takes the previously OP Prismatic build we had a while back and making a few changes to it, so that we can redesign it around the new artifact, because there are a lot of pretty decent perks in there that we can use to amplify our build and make it a bit stronger in today's current sandbox in Destiny 2 Heresy. Now with this build, you will be able to run around like a god in endgame content like an expert or master lost sector, even whilst 30 to 40 under the recommended power level, so you can clearly see that this build does live on and can handle some extreme situations. We're going to have a powerful melee attack where we'll be able to punch enemies to go invisible and get health back on kills, so it is great to quickly escape if you're close to dying, but because of the new artifact perks affecting void and machine guns, well, we are just going to simply go ahead and use a void heavy machine gun, what a surprise, and just make that void machine gun trigger a series of buffs and debuffs, like Volatile, which will play an important role in this build since killing debuff targets will make us invisible due to our stylish executioner aspect, which I'll talk about soon. I was considering at first to make this a dedicated void build and use the new aspect that we got, but considering we can benefit from both weakening and radiant, we can get a stackable DPS buff, which in my opinion makes using Prismatic for this build better than a dedicated void one. Not only that, but it does give us that flexibility of using either the golden gun or a tether super, so I mean you can just use any super on the Prismatic, but those two are more ideal. I did end up going with the golden gun because by matching our super to the elemental buff that we get, we won't just be getting radiant effects, but we'll also get restoration sometimes too, so everything just works together nicely to give us a ton of buffs and debuffs. But it is worth noting though that radiant did get nerfed, so it now only provides a 20% damage buff instead of 25%, but it is still worth using because some extra damage is better than no buff at all. Now the very basic way you would use this build initially is you would run in and dodge near an enemy to apply a slow debuff to them, then kill them with a melee attack. Doing this will give you an orb, radiant, restoration, and invisibility, and by just repeating that process over and over, you'll have those buffs infinitely. And that's basically how the build works originally, but now this season we do have an added bonus. So by using void weapons, ideally a void machine gun, and then rapidly killing enemies, you will apply volatile debuffs passively, basically having infinite volatile rounds for void weapons, and because you're defeating those debuff targets regardless of them being killed by a weapon and not your melee, you will still go invisible. So in a way, after every single kill, you're going invisible, and you can just loop that constantly, which is kind of insane considering that we're not required to use any exotic armor to achieve this, like you would usually use a Jeff Falcons or a weapon with certain perks. Now that being said, there are some really good weapon perks you can combine with this build. One of them actually got buffed this season too, which is the destabilizing rounds. So now with destabilizing rounds, defeating a target creates a void burst. Hitting other targets with that burst then makes them volatile and grants you volatile rounds for a short duration. Since the build is designed around volatile, we will want to apply volatile rounds as much as we can, so you can either do this with a perk like destabilizing rounds, or you can do this through our seasonal artifact by using the volatile marksman, where rapid void weapon precision hits and rapid void weapon final blows grant volatile rounds. Of course, using both just increases the uptime and might be a bit overkill, but the option is there for you. So as long as you can apply those volatile debuffs from any source quite consistently, then you'll be fine with this build. You could actually use the artifact perk and combine it with a void weapon that has Repulsor Brace, because regardless you'll be applying volatile constantly anyway, and then defeating those volatile targets won't just make you invisible, but you'll also get an overshield as well if you are using a weapon with Repulsor Brace. So that is another thing to consider, and you can do that. It does work nicely with the build, so we aren't just a full dedicated melee prismatic build. We do have the power of weapons too this season, which just makes the build a bit different than it usually would play out. Some good weapons I like to use this build are a Commemoration Machine Gun, which you can get from the Deepstone Crypt raid, and it is also craftable, but this is a great ad clearing weapon, especially this season, because it is a void machine gun, and currently within our artifact we have a few perks benefiting machine guns. You got Hold the Line to increase its reload speed, but also Final Blow to heal you, so you'd become invisible, get health, and if you had a void machine gun with Repulsor Brace, you could also have an overshield too, all from killing that one enemy with a void machine gun, which is kinda wild. And if that's not enough, rapidly applying volatile effects, which we'll do with our void weapon, will cause a weakening burst, so that will debuff enemies for that 15% damage debuff, but we can continuously chain that loop of volatile and weaken by using void flux, so defeating weakened targets with void weapons, apply volatile to nearby targets. The whole loop of these effects being applied constantly really makes this build strong, considering that all these effects are classed as debuffs, and this is important because in our Prismatic Hunter we are using the Stylish Executioner, which is a void aspect where defeating a target affected by any elemental debuff grants invisibility, and that can be through Weaken, Volatile and Slow, which are the three main debuffs that we'll be applying constantly. How we will be applying slow is through our second aspect, the Winter Shroud, where dodging slows nearby targets, but by using Combination Blow, killing an enemy with the melee refills our class ability and restores health, and that's how you chain between the infinite dodges and melees, which then just makes you invisible, weakens targets, and the cycle just repeats over and over. It's essentially the same thing with using a void weapon, because we're applying volatile, so you don't just now have to be up close and personal, but you do have that range advantage as well. A really good exotic void weapon that you can use with this build is the Collective Obligation, as this can leech void debuffs. So since it will apply debuffs anyway as it's a void weapon, you can basically consume those buffs into the weapon and then fire it back out at any time. So it is an on-demand instant debuff whenever you want, and this can be great to quickly debuff a boss for more DPS with other weapons. Just make sure that whatever weapon you do use, that it is a void weapon. For the exotic armor, if you're using a golden gun, then use a Celestial Nighthawk for the extra damage on that super. If you're using a tether, use an Orpheus Rig for faster supers. These are the two most used and most ideal supers and exotics to use for this build, but if you don't use those exotics, a good alternative is the Falcons, but in my opinion, specifically for this season, it's just not worth running because it will be a bit overkill with the volatile rounds and you just simply don't need it. It's worth bearing in mind that if you're using a Void Super, you will get an overshield when picking up an orb due to the Facet of Purpose, but if you're using a Solar Super, you'll get Restoration, so just keep that in mind. But as for the other 4 fragments, we have Facet of Bravery for the extra volatile rounds, although you can change this if you want to. Facet of Blessing, so melee final blows start health regen, just another way to get health since melee kills will only restore health, not actually trigger the health regeneration. Facet of Dawn is the next one, so we can become Radiant on melee hits for that 20% damage buff to weapons, and Facet of Protection for obviously extra protection when surrounded by enemies. When it comes to applying mods, 2 hands-on in the helmet are great mods to use for extra super energy, since we are a melee heavy build, so I'd recommend using those, but every other mod you can just use cooldown mods if you want to, or anything else that you prefer. It doesn't really make much of a difference. Just bear in mind that when you are using this build in endgame content like a GM, avoid punching ads in the face when you don't have a combination blow buff stacked up, because you will most likely instantly get punched back and die on the spot, so just be aware of that. This build is strong, but you still have to play it smart, don't just run in and instantly get wrecked. But overall, this build is probably one of the best hunter builds out there right now for the Prismatic subclass this season specifically, and it does a great job at ad clearing with those powerful punches, but I'd still use this in Legend of Master Lost Sectors solo, or any activity for that matter, but definitely give this build a try. Let me know what you think of it down below, and also don't forget to check out that playlist for more builds like this, and I'll see you all very soon for that next video. Peace out guys.